So in the last video, we just had a very brief overview of the EU and the UK. And in this video, we're going to look at some of the key terms you're going to come across as set the homework and you start to study the EU in a bit more detail. So just to recap where we are, we're doing the final syllabus section of UK government, and it's called Relationship Between the Branches, and we're looking at the aims, role and impact of the European Union government. So here's our EU, 28 states, of course 27 now with the UK gone, and some of the key terms we're going to look at are integration, which we've mentioned already, enlargement we've mentioned already, and now we're going to look at the four freedoms, QMV, qualified majority voting, supranational bodies, what are they and which are the supranational bodies in the EU, intergovernmental bodies, pool sovereignty, which we've mentioned in the last video, and democratic deficit. First one, quite straightforward, integration. We've looked at this in the last video. The process of coordinating the activities of the different states through common institutions and policies, which in practice often means diluting or ceding or pooling the degree of sovereignty of each nation involved. So this process of integration, ever closer union. Enlargement, very self-explanatory, the expansion of the EU to include new member states. Excuse the typo. So it would be, let me do it while I'm doing it, from the original 6 to the current 28. Next one then is the four freedoms, which is quite an important one in your syllabus. So the four freedoms of the EU are seen as the four pillars of EU integration, especially the single market. And the four freedoms comprise the free movement of goods, the free movement of services, the free movement of capital, and the free movement of workers. Of course, the EU is very keen in any new relationship with the EU to maintain these three freedoms, less keen on this one. In fact, Boris has said it's not going to be there anymore, and it'll be a real sticking point in the negotiations, as it was in Brexit. Economically, these benefit us hugely, so it's in our interest to try and keep these, but the EU says you can't cherry pick, you can't have which bits of the freedoms you like and which bits that you don't. Next one now is supranational bodies and intergovernmental bodies. And in the middle section of this, you can see is a diagram of the EU organizations. And it's a very funny kind of hybrid thing, which really doesn't fit into any of the structures that we've looked at before. It's a hybrid, which is a good word we use in electoral systems. So you can see the three main institutions are the European Parliament, the Council of the European Union, and the European Commission. And the Commission is a bit like the executive, but it overlaps with this Council of the European Union, and the legislature is really the Parliament, and that also overlaps with the Council of the European Union. But again, it's an awkward kind of fit. It doesn't fit into a particular model. And then over here, you have basically the equivalent of the Supreme Court, which is the European Court of Justice, which rules on whether countries are keeping to the treaties or not. So how do we, voters, interact with these institutions? Well, this is us up here. Our main interaction, our direct interaction, was the elections to the European Parliament, which we looked at before using the party list system. So the European Parliament is the only one of those institutions that's directly elected by citizens of the EU. And there are lots of flaws with those elections in terms of turnout and interest, and often there's simply referendums in the governing party. Our other interaction is indirectly. We elect our national governments, like we have elected the Conservative government in the UK. And then the Prime Minister and his government, they appoint the European Commission. So each of the main areas, trade, environment, etc., have a commissioner from each country, and those commissioners are appointed by the national governments. So although they represent us, they're indirectly appointed by us. The national governments form, for like the leaders of each country, the prime ministers or the presidents, form what's called the Council of the European Union. And so that's how the EU structures. So the supranational bodies, a supranational body is a body which transcends or sits above a national boundaries or governments. They operate above these governments and can, usually by agreement with these governments, impose rules on them. A different example would be, for example, the UN, or particularly the UN Security Council. It's a supranational body. It can impose decisions on the member states. And in the EU, you can see you have a number of supranational bodies here. The Commission is a supranational body. The European Parliament is a supranational body. The Court of Justice is a supranational body. The Council of the European Union, where the heads of governments meet, they're called intergovernmental bodies, where prime ministers and leaders meet, and often they try and defend their national interests in there. But these other institutions are institutions of the EU, and they are supranational. So the last slide here, just a grab from one of the textbooks. Here, the Council of the European Union, the leaders, and with cooperation with the Commission, might set the broad outlines of where they want to go. Then the Commission has the sole responsibility for producing a draft law. That can go to national parliaments for scrutiny. It also goes to the European Parliament, and it's also discussed with the different ministers or whoever are involved. The laws can be amended, and then if it's approved, it's adopted by the national governments and it becomes EU law. That's a very simplified process. There's directives and regulations as well, which we'll come across later on. But these are the supranational bodies, the bodies which sit above nations, and then you have the intergovernmental bodies, which are where the leaders of the nations, for example, could be ministers, work together, or prime ministers. So looking at the supranational bodies in the EU, you have the European Commission. It's like the civil service stroke executive of the EU, and the nation states have ceded some degree of sovereignty to this. So members of the Commission are appointed by member states. So we don't get to elect these people, but they are appointed by people who we have elected, such as the Prime Minister. But once they're appointed, they swear allegiance to the EU, not their own country. So they're meant to work to further the aims of the EU, not the country from which they were appointed, which is perhaps why they were so disliked by Eurosceptics in whatever country. The second supranational body is the European Court of Justice. Again, nothing to do with the European Convention on Human Rights or the Human Rights Act, and some of you are still writing that in your essays. The main European court for that is the European Court of Human Rights, which has nothing to do with the EU. But the European Court of Justice is like the supranational Supreme Court of the EU, sits in Luxembourg. And the court decides whether EU laws and actions of the Commission member states conform to founding treaties, and imposes fines on member states that violate EU law. So if there's a dispute between country and the EU, or between different countries within the EU as to whether they're following what's in the treaties, that would end up in the European Court of Justice, and their ruling is final. They're supranational. The European Parliament, again, is a supranational parliament in the EU. It can do a number of things. It can amend legislation, it can reject the budget, but it doesn't have a line item veto, as we'll see in the EU, so it can't reject individual items. It can question the Commission. It can dismiss the entire Commission, but it can't dismiss individual commissioners. So it's a power, but it's a rarely used power. But the European Parliament, of the supranational bodies, is probably the weakest of these bodies there are. And the one I didn't mention in the previous slide, there is the European Central Bank, because countries who join the euro sign up to the European Central Bank as well. And this implements EU policy and sets a common interest rate for members of the Eurozone, countries which have joined the Euro, which of course the UK never joined up, which is why we have the Independent Commission in the Bank of England that sets our interest rates. But it does rob countries of a fair degree of economic sovereignty or independence, those that are in the Euro. So these are the supranational bodies. Qualified majority voting. When EU membership was in single figures, 6 or 8, each country had a veto on policy proposals. And you could say, no, we don't want to do this. Can we move on to the next item then? But as the EU enlarged, you couldn't really give every country a veto. Imagine all these countries having a veto on something. It just wouldn't work, and you'd have so much negotiation to try what you need to do to overcome the veto. So they introduced this system called qualified majority voting. It can be quite a complicated system, but essentially it boils down to each country that sits around the table in the EU has a certain number of votes, weighted votes, depending on their population, the size of the economy. So the four largest ones would have 29 votes. So Germany, UK, France and Italy had 29 votes, and then you can see what the other countries had depending on their size and their contribution. So if an issue is being decided, broadly speaking these days, it goes to a vote, and then each country can give their votes. But what it means is that no individual country can really now block a proposal, that it can be outvoted by a combination of other countries, even large countries, Germany, the UK, etc. Another block of smaller countries could unite against them to pass or to block something. What that means, of course, which is very annoying for Eurosceptics, was that the UK and other countries no longer had a veto on every policy that was discussed. There are still some areas that countries can exercise a veto, but more and more policy decisions are decided by this idea of qualified majority voting, which again diluted countries' sovereignty because there was areas they no longer had the veto on. So QMV was a significant development in the EU. Pool sovereignty, we've mentioned already in the previous video, the combination of national sovereignties to enhance their power and influence, and we looked at why it was not a particularly uncontroversial topic. The areas in which the UK had handed over, whatever you want to call it, jurisdiction, competence, sovereignty to, and the areas it hadn't, and what way membership impacted. And finally, the significant criticism of the EU. And it's hard to get away from these despite the good things the EU has done. This idea that it suffers from a democratic deficit. Not only are its institutions distant from citizens, I mean, like we said before, can you name your MEPs? If you stopped 100 people in the street, I mean, nobody would tell you exactly how does the EU actually work, because most people think the EU is Europe, but of course the EU is a political institution. The procedures within the EU, they lack transparency, and there's some bog standard ones that are really terrible, and that, for example, MEPs can claim expenses and they don't provide any evidence of how they spend it, because obviously they're all honourable people. Only one of its institutions is directly elected. It's the European Parliament, and that happens to be the weakest of the EU institutions. And there are questions about the accountability and the legitimacy of that institution. Very low turnouts, again very distant from citizens. The European Court of Justice and the Commission are both appointed, they're not directly elected, and these are arguably the most powerful institutions in the EU. So this idea that there's a democratic deficit, if your bank account's in deficit, there's much in it as there should be. A democratic deficit, so the EU isn't as democratic as it should be. And countries like the UK were also critical of the continued drift towards ever greater integration, the loss of national sovereignty, and that was a significant factor in the Brexit referendum, and obviously the particularly salient one at the time was the fourth pillar, the free movement of people and immigration. So these are some of the terms that you'll come across and that you'll be writing essays about in the future. So integration, enlargement, four freedoms, QMV, supranational bodies, intergovernmental bodies, pool sovereignty, and democratic deficit.